Thank you, everyone. We're going to have the opportunity to chat some more after or near the end of the meeting. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Laura Parker to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. It is brilliant to see so many people. We are constantly both amazed, I think, but also really encouraged by how many of you give up so much time for this campaign. And thank you in advance for all those brilliant submissions. Thank you also to our speaker, Rob Ford. He's been a great support to the campaign. Many of you will have heard Rob speak before. He is the Professor of Politics or Political Science, I think it is, at the University of Manchester. And just a quick word about universities. Joe mentioned at the beginning, there are strikes. There are strikes all over the place at the moment, and one of them is the University and College Union. 70,000 staff in 150 universities are taking strike action for pay, working conditions and pensions. And whether we're online or not, I think most of us, I hope all of us would agree that we don't want to cross any picket lines, but just to sort of make it clear, the lovely Rob is doing this gig for free. And it's also his spare time to the extent that he has any. So just to reassure you all, this doesn't count as strike breaking. But nevertheless, thank you, Rob. We're really, really, really glad that we've got you with us this evening. I recommend to you all his books, Brexit Land, which obviously is about Brexit, the British general election of 2019, which is a hot off the press one for those of you really into polling. And then Rob obviously decided at some point he needed to spice up the title, so he's also written a book called Sex, Lies and the Ballot Box. And when he realised that that sold well to students, he produced another one called More Sex, Lies and the Ballot Box. So that was a canny bit of marketing. So I recommend all of those to you. And Rob, I'm going to put you very briefly through your paces in my probably poor impression of Emily Maitlis, with a few key questions. And then I think we'll open it up to our incredibly well-informed audience. And then you can tell us at the end if we would all get a degree from the University of Manchester or not. But my first sort of question is, what is going on? What is going on politically? Can you give us a bit of a whistle-stop tour of polling, what it's saying about the prospects for the Labour Party at the next election? Perhaps some analysis of whether you think those polls are way off. Yeah, essentially, what is happening?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I mean, unusually for me, I don't have a bunch of PowerPoint slides with clever graphs on them, so it's a little bit like doing the high wire act without a safety net for me. So I'll try and do my best in terms of doing it off the top of my head. So I think the best starting point for thinking about where we are now is actually 18 months ago, because we're roughly 18 months away probably from when an election campaign will begin in earnest. You'll see sometimes journalists saying that an election is theoretically possible in January 2025. I'm afraid I don't buy it, because I cannot believe that the Conservative Party, even in its current state, would inflict Christmas campaigning on its members, or indeed on you lot. So I think the likeliest point for an election is probably November or early December. That'll give them a chance to do a final round of rabbit out of the hat stuff at party conference season in sort of autumn 2024. So 18 months ago was summer of 2021, and at that point you had people like Tim Shipman writing about 10 years of Boris Johnson government to come, unassailable leads for the Conservative Party. The Hartlepool by-election had gone to the Conservatives. The local elections have been a big disappointment for Labour, etc., etc. I mention that for two reasons. Firstly, to illustrate how far we have come in terms of the change in public opinion, and secondly, as a cautionary note, that 18 months is still quite a long time in politics, so there is still time for things to change. Where we have gone since then is pretty clearly a very steep downward trajectory for the Conservatives, which, well, the end of Boris started that in a big way. He ended his time as Prime Minister with absolutely toxic leadership ratings, some of the worst leadership ratings ever received by any leader. Then Liz Truss came in and said, hold my beer, and achieved even worse leadership ratings within 3 months, and then got ejected. I believe Liz Truss's final leadership ratings are actually the worst leadership ratings anyone ever has received. And Kwasi Kwarteng's ratings as Shadow Chancellor are the worst, as Chancellor, were the worst ever received by a Chancellor. Rishi Sunak was brought in clearly with a mandate to steady the ship. And in a sense, that's worked because things have improved on the kind of dismal lows that they fell to under Truss. But there's not been a big rebound. Where they are now is roughly where they were a year ago. And where they were a year ago was terrible. In fact, terrible enough that people were already talking about whether or not Boris Johnson would have to go. The only reason, well, there's two reasons, in fact, that Conservative MPs are trying to sound optimistic about this. One is they kind of have to, I mean, otherwise give up. And the other is that the Truss experience is fresh in their memory. So it does feel like an improvement. You know, if the fire that burnt half your house down gets put out, it feels like an improvement, but your house is still half a smouldering ruin. And that's kind of where they are in polling terms. It's not just leadership either. Labour now lead on every single issue except, I think, possibly national security and defence. They lead on immigration, they lead on the economy, they lead on health, they lead on education, they lead on everything. That hasn't happened since the mid-1990s. Keir Starmer consistently outpolls Rishi Sunak in the who do you think would be the best Prime Minister question. That hasn't happened since the mid-90s. Headline poll leads of 20 points plus hasn't happened since the mid-90s. All of which suggests Labour are in a pretty good position with 18 months to go. But two notes of caution. One, the electoral geography next time is extremely difficult. Indeed, one of the reasons why all of you are here in this room wanting to reform the electoral system is because the electoral system is currently a deck stacked heavily against the Labour Party because of the geography of its vote. That means Labour needs a swing roughly of the scale achieved in 1997 just to get a majority of two, just to get a notional majority of anything at all. So they need really, really big poll leads in order to be in the game. The other reason for caution, which I wrote about on my new Substack recently, there's another thing for me and Laura to promote, is that parties do have a tendency to swing back from their midterm lows, and this seems to be particularly a tendency for Conservative incumbent governments. They do tend to claw some ground back. 1992 is being bandied about a lot as an example of this. That's certainly true. It was also true in 1983. It was also true in 1987. So there is, history suggests, at least some chance that the Conservatives will claw back some of this ground. And you combine history with geography, and you get a situation where the polls don't have to narrow an awful lot to be in a situation where a majority Labour government is once again in doubt. So that's where we are. I mean, I think anybody in the Labour Party, if they'd have been given this set of polling numbers 2 years ago, would have taken it in a heartbeat. It's as close to as good as it gets for an opposition. But there are still reasons to be cautious. I think anybody who's had any experience with the Labour Party will always be cautious with regards elections. But so there are still that things could turn around at least a little bit before then.
That's really interesting, and your caution is obviously very much in line with the messaging coming from the Labour leadership itself, which is sort of saying complacency, it's a killer, you know, let's not get carried away with ourselves, don't start measuring the Downing Street curtains just yet. Those are the numbers. Are there any particular factors that you think could swing the numbers against Labour? Are there particular issues that are likely to shift? How much does the general sort of British public sense of it's time for someone else to have a go, how much will that just be in our favour anyway, come what may? It's kind of surely someone else's turn.
Well, yes. I mean, that in a way, that's the big unknown. Is this now, if you go back through all of the general election books over the years, you'll find the ones where the government lost and the opposition took over tend to be ones where there was a kind of general zeitgeist of this lot have had enough time in charge, it's time for somebody else to be in charge. It does feel like that at the moment, but then there have been a few other elections where it looked like that for a while, and then things changed again, people decided. So the two big unknowns really are, can the government make any progress on the issues that people care about most? Well, three questions, I guess. One is, can the government make any progress on the issues that are top of the agenda right now? NHS, inflation, economy, cost of living. Number two is, can they shift the issue agenda to some sort of area where they feel they would be on better ground competitively against Labour? And obviously in conservative strategist minds, that tends to be Brexit, immigration and woke politics, whatever they think that is right now. And then the third question is, do voters continue to harbour doubts about whether or not Labour are ready for office? My view is that there are pretty good reasons for optimism on the Labour side on all of those questions. I don't think there's enough time left on the clock governmentally for them to make much progress on the NHS. Inflation probably will come down, that's out of their control, but everyone's going to be feeling the hit in their wallets anyway. And I don't really see things, you know, it's literally their target that you'd only have to wait half an hour for an ambulance if you have a heart attack a year from now. If that's their goal, if that's their look how well we're doing goal, well, they're screwed, frankly. I mean, nobody's going to buy that. So on the current agenda, I think they've got a real problem because they don't have the time they need to make the kind of progress they need. If they put like masses of money behind those kinds of issues, that might happen, but Tory MPs are already starting to bang the drum for tax cuts that nobody in the public wants, and they'll kibosh any effort to actually throw the kind of money at public services that would be needed to turn it around. Which brings us to point two, will they try and change the agenda? They definitely will try. I don't think it will work. The public are now more liberal on immigration than they've ever been. I've written about that recently. They no longer care about Brexit, and to the extent they care about Brexit, they think it's completely balked. So bringing that onto the agenda isn't going to help. And I'm sorry, but with the best will in the world, you're not going to get people to care about culture wars at more than like a 5% level of salience. 95% of the public are not going to care about that if they can't get an ambulance and their kids can't get into school and their pay's getting cut. You can't convince them that this other stuff is the main issue. I'm sorry, there's a limit. Even if you've got like the right-wing press behind you, there's a limit to how much you can tell people that apples fall up in the air. It doesn't work. So I don't think Labour have too much to worry about on that front, and I think the Tories will really struggle to make a case that they deserve another chance on the incumbency front. The big doubt, though, remains, are Labour ready for government? And that's where you see Starmer's indifferent poll numbers being slightly a problem. That's where you see the fact that the kinds of leads they're getting on the issues now, they're good, but they're not as good as they were when Labour won, returned to office last in the mid-90s. That's where I can see at least some potential for the numbers to squeeze down a bit. There are, I think, quite a lot of voters out there who are extremely hacked off with the government, but still retain lingering doubts about the opposition. And the obvious sort of cost to that is, well, how can they think that any Labour opposition could be worse than this lot? Well, I mean, life's not fair, unfortunately, and that just is a problem. It's always a handicap for Labour.
That's really, well, again, sort of calls for optimism, but also some words of caution. Can you say something about the boundary changes, including for those of us who don't follow these things quite as closely as your students, when these bloody things happen and what they might mean for Labour?
Yeah, I mean, here I'm going to plagiarise a very smart analyst, the guy who invented the red wall, in fact, James Kanangasorian. He did a piece on the boundary changes recently. He's done some clever modelling of it. I haven't got around to doing anything on that yet, but he made a couple of really nice observations. The first is they do help the Conservatives a little bit in terms of seats, but not as much as you might think. I mean, they pick up a few in the southeast. Labour lose a few in Wales and stuff, but you're talking like half a dozen seats. But the bigger gain for the Conservatives from these new boundaries is it makes a lot of their seats safer than they are right now. So it plumps up a lot of Conservative majorities, and that's, I mean, I gave the figure of like the 97 swing, 13-point swing. That's on the new boundaries. It would have been about 10 or 11 points on the old boundaries, but the hill Labour has to climb got that little bit higher as a result of these new boundaries. All of the sort of majorities that you see from last time, a lot of them on the Conservative side will get a little bit bigger. In terms of when it officially all comes in, that's due to be this autumn. I think they're doing the final rounds of like you know, comments and adjustments and whatnot, but nothing's likely to change a great deal. Once upon a time, 18 months ago, there was a lot of debate about whether or not the Conservatives would go early this May. I remember fielding all sorts of queries from journalists saying, oh, there's going to be an election in May 2023, it's nailed on. And I was like, no, I don't think so. Because that would mean that they could go on the old boundaries without having to bring the new boundaries in. And a lot of them, you know, there's a lot of MPs that didn't want to change seats and stuff. Of course, that's not going to happen. I can't see them not doing these boundaries at this point. The old boundaries are now massively out of date. And a lot of the MPs who are going to be affected by it have already started making their decisions. So I think that's definitely coming in. Oh,
oops, unmuted myself. That's very interesting. Now, another change coming, which I think many of us are just opposed to in principle, even if it affects only a very small number of people, is the requirement for voter ID. But it would also be interesting. I mean, I think there's a principal point, but there's also, you know, again, the numbers. Can you give us a sense of what difference that might make? And I realise that really is a bit crystal ball gazing, but
I mean, it's a tricky question to answer. I mean, because the situation in Britain is a little bit unusual with voter ID being new, and with us being a country that unusually, in terms of developed democracies, doesn't have some sort of universal identification system. So in America, where voter ID has also been a kind of hot button political issue, because identity requirements are a state level thing, and lots of state Republican parties have run on making voter ID more restrictive. A number of academics have looked at it and found that it doesn't really make a great deal of difference. There certainly isn't much of a partisan effect. There's a bit of a turnout effect, but it kind of washes out because most of those who really want to vote, you know, this is not sufficient to deflect them. And the ones who are kind of very marginal, low information voters don't really have a particularly strong partisan lean one way or the other. But the thing is about America, that kind of stuff has been a political football for a number of election cycles now. So often what this is changes in which kind of ID you use. The idea that you have to register, you'll need ID, all of that's very familiar to Americans. What's unusual here is that, you know, people are not used to this being something they need to do when they show up. I think that you're doing it everywhere for this year's locals, so that might give us a sense of what it's like. But locals are low turnout elections, so you tend to get the most organised and committed voters. It's not clear whether it would have a substantial effect. The existing academic literature gives cause for doubt, but if it does have an effect, the kinds of voters it will most likely affect will be the ones who are least likely to have the relevant ID, which tends to be younger voters, low information voters, and the ones who don't realise that this is going to be a thing that they need, which also tends to be lower information voters. And given the age break in current voting, anything that ends up putting off younger voters is likely to have an incrementally negative effect on Labour. On the other hand, lower information, semi-disengaged voters can often break a bit conservative, so it's hard to say. I would say we can be fairly sure the effects will not be massive. Will it change many seats? Probably not. Will it stop people from voting who legit have a right to vote and want to vote and should be able to vote? Definitely. Is it a bad idea? Undoubtedly. This is not a problem. This is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. So, you know, I would be 100% against it and want it gotten rid of as soon as possible. But whether it would have a major impact on the election outcome, I think not. But, you know, any good Democrat does not want to see anybody who's got a legit right to vote ending up not being able to vote on election day. And I fear that quite a lot of people, I'm talking probably tens of thousands, maybe even more than that, will not end up not voting on election day, and there'll probably be stories of some quite chaotic scenes in places with, say, very large student populations or something like that. So I'm a bit pessimistic about the detailed politics of it, but not about how it affects the landscape.
Okay, that's really interesting. So that's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Both Gordon Brown in his Brown Commission report at the end of last year, and then Keir in his speech at the start of New Year, talked about things that I'm pretty sure all of us on this call would agree are problems that do exist, not least massive levels of disenchantment from the British public in general, and dissatisfaction in politics at sort of record levels. Both Gordon Brown and Keir talked about further devolution and power. Brown also talked about reform of the Lords. Do you have any sort of general observations about either or both of their speeches? I mean, I know that you are a politics nerd because you're paid to be one, so I'm sure you've read the Brown Commission, and I'm pretty sure you've listened to the Keir speech, and it would just be interesting to hear your reflections about both.
Yeah, I mean, the Brown Commission, it was, I mean, the thing that really sort of stood out for me about that was how big, well, it was two things really. I mean, the first is how big it's going on devolution within England. And there was a lot in there that hinted at, though not always spelling out fully, like there's a lot of policy devolution talk, and implicitly, although never quite spelled out, there seems to be some sort of sense of potentially fiscal devolution as well, so that like local areas will have more control over more resources, maybe even be able to raise their own resources. I mean, I think that's a really great development, because I think we have a massively over-centralised polity, and that's really harmful. The Treasury is probably one of the agents of mass destruction in British politics, so anything that gives them less power is really good. However, from the perspective of the people in this room, the thing that worries me a little bit about that, and also about the second theme that Gordon Brown went very large on, which was a very vaguely defined reform to the House of Lords, is that will end up taking up all the oxygen in the room on the issue of constitutional reform, and potentially pull attention and energy away from reform of the electoral system. In particular, it does seem to me to be a big concern that they're like, oh, we've got to reform the House of Lords, but they don't have any kind of firm idea as to what that reform would look like, because that happened in the Blair years and it ended with nothing happening because they couldn't agree anything after arguing about it for ages. I'm a bit worried that'll happen again, particularly once Labour have got their seat under the table in power and they start to think, oh, well, patronage appointments to the House of Lords are quite useful, actually. Maybe let's keep it around. So I'm a little bit, I mean, I'm excited about the devolution elements of it, but they potentially distract attention from an electoral reform agenda. And I'm a bit lukewarm about, like, let's reform the House of Lords, but I have no idea how. I mean, seriously, Gordon, you've been around. Give us some more specific ideas. And then with Keir's speech, I was more encouraged by that, in particular because it seems to me that he's writing some quite big checks that he's going to have to cash. I mean, it was clever politics to use the take back control theme. And I think the general argument, you know, you all voted for Brexit because the system's broken and you wanted it changed, but you basically misunderstood which bit of the system was broken. He doesn't say that last bit, obviously. He never says, all Leave voters, you're wrong or whatever. But that's kind of the general argument. You know, it's still broken. You're angry again. This is a fix that will actually work. It's interesting because it's one of the, which I think maybe one of your questions later, Laura, it's one of the ways in which one can make constitutional reform, which is often quite a geeky issue, electorally resonant. It's what Cummings did. He said, this stuff is broken. We will fix it. Mandating this will fix it. And that does seem to be the direction he's going in with this topic. And that's a big check to write. And it'll be a hard one to back away from if he's in government. He can't then turn around and say, oh, we'll just fiddle around at the edges, nothing to see here, because he's making some pretty strong statements about this stuff. So I'm encouraged by that.
So to pick up on that last point, Joe, just before you joined us, began this meeting sort of rather depressingly, but obviously accurately, with a short reflection on the fact that at the moment, you know, not much is working. I mean, not only are your many of your colleagues are on strike. You know, like this morning, I don't know if this is nationwide, but I spent 20 minutes at a bus stop before I realised that no bus was coming because the buses were on strike, at least in South London, and I think probably elsewhere. You know, the nurses, civil servants, the fire brigade. I mean, the list is becoming pretty endless. Not to mention the crises in the service, even if they're not on strike. Are the public connecting these very real, teachers? You know, I couldn't get to work, and my kid's not at school. Are the public connecting these really obvious and tangible crises in day-to-day life with the political system? I mean, are those dots joined up in the eyes of the public, or are they just thinking, well, that's politicians, and just changing the people will? I mean, for us, of course, we would like to change the people, but we'd also like to change the system as well. But be interested in your sort of insights on that.
I mean, I think on the whole, no, but that's because the kind of 4 or 5 links in the chain system thinking that's involved in making, in working out that whole logic, most voters don't go in for that. So, an awful lot of people are basically in the kind of mental state of everything's broken. This lot have been in charge for ages. You know, the phrase that focus groups keep hearing is, you've had 13 years, why is it all broken? Therefore, kick them out, put somebody else in who will, in some sense, fix it. I think there is also a kind of general sentiment, and it's went back to Brexit. It went away briefly during the Brexit debates, coming back again of, that there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. Things are broken in some sense, but people don't link it very much to detailed discussion of institutions and constitutional reform. They don't, like, inherently, like, without some sort of clear narrative framing this in a way that they can understand. But again, I think one of the kind of unintended positive effects for constitutional reformers of the past decade is, Scotland and Wales have had kind of running demonstrations of how, things can be different with different levels of government for a while. And so they understand that you can fix broken things by changing institutions. And it's no wonder that that's been channeled into demands for greater devolution, demands for independence and stuff like that. They have a kind of demonstrated understanding of the institutional link. But thanks to city region devolution, I think growing parts of the country also recognise that there is a solution that doesn't run through Westminster, but instead runs through handing more power to people locally. And you've got, as a result of those devolution reforms, some rather high-profile people who are good at making that link, whose jobs depend on making that link, whose whole approach to politics is to basically represent these places and try and win more support and more assistance for these places. And I think that makes it easier to make the argument in terms of devolution particularly. It's still a bit harder in terms of electoral system reform, because people just don't really get what the benefits of that are till they see what the benefits of that are. In the abstract, it's hard to say this will make politics better. It's a tricky argument to win, even in an environment like right now when politics is really bad.
That's interesting. So, and in fact, you've now touched on what will be my last question before we ask our campaign supporters. It seems to me you're suggesting that it is possible, tenable from a public perspective, for Keir to make what was quite a bold speech in many ways about democratic renewal, and he talked about the crisis in the country and then put front and centre fixing the political system, which for us is a massive strategic advance. Democracy is now on the agenda, and this is very encouraging for our campaign at a strategic level. But it sounds like what you're saying is he can do all that, and Andy Burnham can talk. I mean, of course, Andy's also been great on PR, but Keir can do that, and Gordon can talk about the Lords, minus the detail, and Andy Burnham can talk about devolution. And the public won't necessarily say, but hang on, you're missing electoral reform for the Commons. That's quite a sobering lesson for us as a campaign, but it does sound to me like you're suggesting that from their perspective, that's a tenable and sustainable position. And therefore, part of our job is joining those dots, because they don't necessarily need to, they can get away with that, what we consider to be a massive gap. They can actually get away with it.
Yes, I mean, it is a significant risk for you guys. People don't have a kind of joined up program of constitutional reform in their heads. If you give them fiscal devolution, if you give them more power to local authorities, tweaks for Scotland and Wales, some sort of debate about the Lords, then it would be potentially quite possible for Keir Starmer to get up and say, well, I told you I was going to fix the system, and I did. Look, I did all that stuff. And you won't necessarily get a big upswelling of objections to that. So it is going to be really important to keep the pressure up to make sure people see electoral reform as an essential aspect of that. And oddly enough, I think the better Labour do in the election, the more important that job will become, because if they get a big majority, first of all, a lot of the people who currently want electoral reform because they think the system's sort of stacked against Labour or the left more generally will then be temporarily happy. But also the Labour leadership will feel more secure and will think, well, we've got a big majority, we might get another one. So let's keep the current system because it's working for us now. My view is that it won't work for them for long. That would be hubris that will be followed quite swiftly by nemesis. Bad idea, but it's going to be really important to keep the pressure up. It'll be easier if the majority is small or if it's a hung parliament, because then you'll be able to also enlist the smaller parties who have a strong interest in PR. But what really needs to be emphasised is, number one, the geography is not changing. You get a temporary reprieve, but long run, you're still running at a disadvantage. And number two, if you keep allowing big, unconstrained Conservative majority governments to get in, which only our system as it stands will allow, then you keep allowing them free rein to smash everything up. The next Labour government is going to have to spend most of the first 5 years mopping up all the mess of the last decade. Then you just finish the cleanup job and you want to give the lunatics another shot at smashing it all up again. That's the danger of not reforming the electoral system. And it's messages like that that are going to need to keep being made in an environment. I mean, let's face it, if Labour win the next election, the national mood will shift a great deal. It will be like a big moment of change. People will be very relieved to have kicked out a government that they're very fed up with. It'll be an easy moment to neglect longer term structural reforms like this, or an easy moment where leaderships have a lot of leeway to park things that they may not see as being in their short-term political interests. So it's going to be really important to keep all of the partners that you guys have worked with and built up, people like Andy Burnham and so on board, keeping up the pressure privately and publicly to say, yes, this is a great win, but the hard work comes next. That's going to be really important.
Yeah, and you raise a really critical point, I think, for the campaign, which is that we built or exposed, and I mean we, like all of the people on this call and many, many more, we sort of helped uncover and profile significant amounts of latent party and wider Labour movement support for PR. And I think in the early phases of the campaign, from many individual Labour members and their CLPs, it was about fairness at an individual level. And I think that's right, because Labour members are driven almost beyond most else by, concepts of equality. But we are now having to shift into a more strategic discussion about what this means in terms of who governs the country, and not just this time round, but and how often and for how long, and how much longer it takes them to get back in again. And I think that's quite a different discussion that we now need to promote with the Parliamentary Labour Party and the leadership of the party, which is slightly different to, I'm in Tunbridge Wells and I'm unhappy because my individual vote never counts. That's really interesting. Thank you. I can see already we've got a number of questions. I'm just going to take you as I see you on my screen. And apologies if I get anyone's name slightly wrong. My first question is Joan Hewitt. I don't know where you're from, Joan.
Hi, I'm from Tynemouth in the northeast. I'm really happy to be introduced to Rob for the first time. I'm going to look at all the stuff he publishes. My question is, today the Huffington Post published the YouGov poll about public support. It was quite interesting. Do I believe it though? 66% of the public back nurses, 63% the ambulance drivers, 50% teachers, but get down to universities and it's 38% uni lecturers and 31% back driving examiners. And I think if your driving examiner has cancelled your driving test, you're going to support him whatever he's done when you next get in the car. Anyway, do we trust YouGov?
Yeah, we've got no reason not to trust YouGov. I should declare an interest. A former PhD student of mine works there, who's a very progressive individual. I mean, it's often raised this issue of like Nadim Zahawi, who's obviously been in the news again recently, you know, founded it and was involved with it for a while, but it doesn't affect their polling at all. And in fact, like pollsters are businesses. They don't have any business interest in being like nakedly partisan. It would, you know, it would damage their credibility. They don't make money from political polling. Most of their money's made on market research, and they build the credibility of their brands by being accurate in their polling. If you look at their track record, they're one of the better ones. I mean, there's quite a few good and trustworthy pollsters. I would love to say don't trust a poll that says people rate university staff so much below nurses, but I'm the son of a nurse. I'm not surprised by that.
You're still higher than politicians by a significant chalk.
Yeah.
Nick Wall.
Hey, hi Rob. Nick Wall. I'm the secretary in Pontypridd. That was really good. I'm struck by the comparisons with 1997 in all sorts of ways. But I guess in one way, we're a step behind in that at least Blair, for a very short period of time, was quite interested in PR. You know, he really did play with that quite a bit, but it fell by the wayside. So for me, the game in town is how do we convince Keir? And I'm wondering why he is at the moment seemingly unconvinced. I've got two thoughts that I'd appreciate your comments on. The first is, and it's a fantastic thing about this campaign, it's unrelentingly positive, but should there be a little bit of stick in the sense of what, again, you've just mentioned it, Labour will probably win the next election, but will be really spending most of its time putting things right. And there's a great danger that Starmer's legacy will be another 10 years of Tory government. And shouldn't we be more explicit with that? And my second thought is obviously the whole country has been essentially divided by the trauma of the Brexit referendum. And I just wonder if the Labour leadership, there is a presumption that there has to be a referendum. And part of the reluctance on PR is that presumption, which is a false presumption, of course, because it's in the manifesto and it's been the manifesto of everybody's, all the parties bar the Tories, and we just implement it. Just wonder on your thoughts on that, on why Starmer might be so reluctant.
I mean, they're both very interesting points. So on the referendum point, I agree, actually. I think that the debate about referendums in this country is very peculiar because most countries have very clear, formally defined circumstances in which they hold referendums. Here we don't. There's nothing that says you need to do referendums on X or on Y. And practice on this has varied a great deal, but every so often people pretend like there's some sort of like major, you know, norm that this issue has to be done with a referendum. And the Conservatives have actually handed electoral reform activists a gift inadvertently last year because they've switched the electoral system for city region mayors without anybody having a referendum on it. So if they turn around and say, "Oh, this is a big change, you can't do that without a referendum," you say, "Excuse me, guys, that wasn't, you know, you were singing from a different hymn sheet 2 years ago when you were trying to save the bacon of the mayor of Greater Cambridgeshire or whatever it was, because he lost on transferable votes." So I don't see any reason why one couldn't formulate the reform in terms of, we'll use this system for one election, but we'll commit to a referendum on whether to keep it after that. Let people try before they buy. Why not do it that way? I don't see any reason why not. On the point regarding the dangers, I think that's very well made. I mean, the last time a Conservative government got kicked out on the back of a wave of strikes and high inflation in 1974, the incoming Labour government wasn't able to fix those issues and got kicked out, and we all know what happened after that. So people talking a lot about 1992 and 1997, they might want to talk a bit more about 1974 as well, which does illustrate why entrenching constitutional and institutional change is really, really important, because regardless, in fact, of the magnitude of the win, given how volatile politics is and given how deep-seated many of these problems are, I don't think any Labour government should take it for granted that they'll get more than one term. So they've got to think, what can we do to make sure that changes that matter to us don't just immediately get torched by an incoming Conservative government, which may well end up being even more radical than the current one. It's very hard to say how they'll behave in opposition, but it's by no means guarantee, given the current state of the Conservative membership, that they'll go in a moderate direction.
No, recent events would suggest, well, recent months would suggest quite the opposite. Vicky.
Hi. I know this is a Labour forum, but I have to say I'm a bit concerned that there's been no discussion at all about how you work with other parties of the centre-left, and it's almost as if it's always going to continue to be Labour versus the Tories, and that's the only thing one needs to think about is what happens in the Labour Party. Whereas, of course, if you do get PR, you're going to have to work with other parties. And that whole thing about how you now establish a practice of looking wider than simply Labour supporters to more either on the centre-left, further to the left, to make sure that the opposition to the Tories is magnified, which of course PR will encourage. So I'm not hearing any discussion at all about moving beyond that very straightened Labour perspective.
I mean, I would say certainly, Vicky, that I completely agree. I should also declare that I'm not a party member, by the way, of the Labour Party.
Neither am I. Neither am I.
And I think that when one looks at the broader political landscape, not just in Britain but across Europe, political kind of diversification is a kind of theme everywhere. Voters, particularly younger voters, want a wider range of choices. They want a wider range of parties to be having a voice in government, and it is incumbent on Labour to think about how to accommodate that. And it's a cultural shift as much as anything. We are used to one monolithic government, one monolithic opposition. That is not how things are done in most places. It will be a big shift. But the other thing is, like, not doing electoral reform won't get rid of that problem. There will still be a substantial number of MPs from third parties. There will still be a very substantial third party vote. You're still going to need to work with other parties. So even aside from the electoral reform issue, Labour does need to have a conversation about that, but electoral reform will bring that in further. And this is another way in which electoral reform advantages Labour. There is a much larger spectrum of parties out there that have a high level of popular support, even though they don't have a lot of MPs, that are natural partners for the Labour Party than there are for the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party, the only party that would be willing to work with them probably is the Reform UK bunch, and those guys can start an argument in an empty room, so they're not exactly easy to work with.
Brilliant summary. Our next question comes from Ken Ritchie, and before we do more propaganda, Rob, for your own publications, although someone has published your Substack in the chat, I just want to do a little mini plug for the Labour campaign for electoral reform. Vicky, your point is well made, but this is a Labour campaign, and if you're not already a member, please join the Labour campaign for electoral reform. Ken Ritchie, you're on mute.
My apologies. Yeah, Rob, my question is about what evidence and arguments you might be able to give us about how electoral reform as an issue might affect polling in an election campaign. My thoughts go back to 2010. Gordon Brown, in his sort of political deathbed, did make a partial conversion to electoral reform, at least to EV. It wasn't because he was in any sense convinced that EV was a good thing or the right thing to do. But there was evidence that was put to him at the time that a change to EV was more likely to win more votes, particularly in a situation where he would have been looking for Liberal Democrat votes, Green votes to boost Labour. Is there any evidence around at the moment? Because I can imagine that if I was in Keir Starmer's position, my focus of my thoughts would be what is actually going to convince people in the seats that we have got to win back if we're going to have a majority. And is there anything that we can use to argue that if Labour was stocking the language of electoral reform, we would be more likely to win extra seats back? It's the sort of thing that we would love to believe, but is there anything from opinion polling or other bits of research that suggests that there is an argument there?
A little, but I'm afraid it's going to be a little bit of encouragement and a rather larger chaser of caveat. The encouragement is that the support for the idea of electoral reform and the gold standard polling on this recently confirmed this, I believe, the British Social Attitudes, run by John Curtis, and is like, as good as it gets as far as public opinion data, shows that support for the principle of reforming the electoral system, the idea that first past the post is broken and it needs to change, is higher than it has ever been for as long as we've had polling. There's a very clear majority in favour of it. So that kind of makes it a potentially vote-winning issue. There's a lot more on the pro side than the anti side. It's also particularly popular issue with groups like younger voters and less partisan voters who are otherwise difficult to engage. So that's the plus side. That's the sort of shot of encouragement. The big chaser of caveat, though, is it's just way less salient with voters than, even in environments that are less tumultuous than currently, it's very seldom a very salient issue. So it's not a big vote winner on its own. It's much better treated as a plank in a broader narrative that speaks to direct concerns that tend to be more salient with voters. And there is always a slight problem with the polling on electoral reform in the abstract, which is that if you ask voters like whether they want to keep the system as it is or change it, then status quo bias kicks in. People tend to like what they have and dislike changes that are unknown. And the reason I think that's particularly a problem is not because I think the Conservatives will make that argument in a very effective way. They'll look like they want to just change the subject away from things that aren't very amenable for them. It's more that if you're Keir Starmer and Lotto, you're on a really winning pitch with the economy, with public services, so you won't want anything that distracts from that messaging. So I think it's a message that will resonate as part of a broader message, but I think the best strategy for getting it into the conversation is probably by trying to combine it with these other things, because then you avoid that kind of either or problem that will then be running straight into the sort of uphill struggle of a very, very cautious, message disciplined Lotto.
That's great, thank you. I'm going to take Rick, then Caroline, who's sitting behind Labour for New Democracy, name, Kevin, and then Rob, we're going to let you go and have your tea. Rick.
Thanks, Laura. And thank you, Rob. It's been a really fascinating discussion, conversation, whatever it is. And thank you very much for coming on to talk to us this evening. I just wanted to wind back to near the beginning of what you had to say this evening and see if you could read us the runes a little bit on the May local elections. And what you think the likely outcomes are, and how those outcomes might affect Conservative decisions about when to go for a general election. So you mentioned earlier on that Labour didn't do as well as maybe they'd hoped to do in the last local elections. What are the runes saying about the next local elections? And is there a chance that the Tories do really badly and then think to themselves, why don't we just cut our losses, go early, let the Labour Party have 5 years in power, in which won't be long enough to fix all the mess that we made, and then we'll come storming back again?
Great question. My mind is actually turning to the locals at the moment, because another one of the hats that I wear is I'm one of the anonymous computer bods behind John Curtis on the election coverage. It's an interesting set of local elections because one of the things that happened in 2019 that was overshadowed by all the other things that were happening in 2019 is you had a set of local elections that happened in the middle of the chaos at the end of the May government, after they'd had to basically punt their deal, and they were having to have European Parliament elections. At that point, the Liberal Democrats were polling first in the polls sometimes. The Brexit Party, it was like sometimes Lib Dems first, Brexit Party second, Labour third, Conservatives fourth. Brexit Party didn't stand in locals, obviously. But you got lots and lots of Lib Dem wins and lots of wins by sort of assorted small micro parties and independents, and a real annihilation for the Conservatives. So in a weird way that helps them because their base is lower than it would have been if it had been a kind of more normal climate in 2019. So they've got less ground that they can lose. On the other hand, the other feature of 2019 is that local elections tend to take place in the bluer bits of the country, you know, because we have this weird geographically asynchronous local election cycles. And these ones tend to be quite shirey, quite south of Englandy. So there are still quite a lot of local councils and councillors that are blue in those places, even after the 2019 sort of hurricane. So they can still lose a lot of ground. My suspicion is they are going to lose a lot of ground. I think Labour gains will be bigger than Tory losses because it wasn't a great set of local elections for Labour either in 2019. So I think it will end up being a very good night for Labour and a pretty bad night for the Conservatives, potentially a disappointing night for the Lib Dems as well, because they're basically defending a high watermark. I don't think this is going to affect when the election comes, simply because McCorberism is a really powerful force in politics. If governments are unpopular, they will cling on in the hope that something will turn up, like Mr. McCorber. I don't think they will think, well, let's just get it out of the way, like a trip to the dentist to remove a wisdom tooth. Much like people with wisdom teeth that are giving them trouble, they want to put it off because it's painful and they don't really want to go through with it. So I don't think it'll affect the election date. What it may affect is the politics of the summer and the autumn, because we're already seeing Boris Johnson pop up on social media and TV again. He clearly wants to be back in the conversation. There are some Conservative backbench MPs who think getting rid of him in the first place was a mistake. If Sunak, on top of poor poll ratings, gets a drubbing in the local elections, then I'm afraid we could have a summer of Conservative internal feuding over whether or not it's a good idea to depose yet another leader and bring back the previous leader but one. So, which, incidentally, if you're a supporter of any party other than the Conservative Party, you're like, well, that's great, because everyone's going to hate that, and they're going to be like, well, why are you arguing with yourselves again when the country's on fire? So that's the way in which I think it will matter politically, not because it will end up moving the general election date, but because it will add another barrier to Conservative messaging and policy being effective, because they'll be feuding again.
Dearie me, what a prospect. Thank you so much. I've got two more questions. I'm going to ask you both to be really, really brief if you can, and I might just take you both together and then we can end with Rob. So Kevin and then Sandy, and then we'll come to you, Rob. Kevin, are you?
Hello, yeah. If Labour get in power, would they do electoral reform and local elections, and would they get rid of House of Lords and elect the Senate and have a PR regional list system? Would they to get that's what Starmer's promising, to get rid of House of Lords and have elected Lords by PR by the regions, the list system, and or STV. And would he get local elections? Would he do electoral reform like AV Plus or the system of Scotland, the additional member system, or New Zealand?
Goodness gracious, crystal ball glazing required. Sandy.
Yeah, thanks. I haven't really got a question. I mean, Rob, brilliant brilliant. Thank you very, very much. I just wanted to say to everyone, Joe did put it in the chat, but I mean, obviously we've won a battle last year. We've still got a long way to go. Anybody here who is a Labour member or supporter and is not yet a member of the Labour campaign for electoral reform, do please join us, because that way you will be part of the whole campaign moving forward over the next 3 or 4 years, because we've got at least 3 or 4 years to go.
Rob, you see, Sandy's showing you how to do propaganda.
Well, I'll take Kevin's question, which is very much in my sort of zone of geekery. I mean, I think there were two interesting questions there. First is, well, what sort of electoral reforms at which level and with which system? And secondly, what sequencing? Now, I think in some respects, going really first of all for local election reform has some advantages, but one significant risk. The advantage is it will bed in the idea of a proportional system in the minds of basically all voters. And we already kind of have a blueprint to work off, because the Scots use STV with multi-member seats. They seem pretty happy with how local government works on that system. There are some significant advantages to that. There will be some significant voices against it within Labour local politics, I think, because it will end sort of a number of political monocultures, which will not be necessarily well received by the people who run those monocultures, but will definitely be good for everybody else. I mean, I'd like to see a little bit more diversity of representation around here in Manchester, for example. So there are a number of advantages to that. It gets people used to the culture of a proportional system and how it works and stuff. The big disadvantage is the clock. It runs down a lot of time, and then there's not time to have the big debate about general election, electoral reform. Other things start to intervene and stuff like that. So there is also a case for going for the general election system first in a sort of big bang. And then in terms of what happens with the Lords reform, I think one of the frustrating things I found about the Brown review is it wasn't exactly clear what sort of electoral system they envisaged for it, and that's exactly how the whole thing ended up on the rocks in the New Labour years, because they had different ideas about how to do it. They couldn't agree, so they didn't do anything. I think if Labour are smart, they should really come down, get this crystallised down to 1 or 2 options very early on, so that they can move to the stage of like trying to implement it, which will be difficult enough. Don't put like 5 or 6 options on the table and then argue about all of those, because then you end up just not getting it done. And I think some sort of a regional list system would be completely fine. I think there are other options that could be completely fine too. I think the critical thing is to make sure that is fleshed out rapidly, so we don't end up with like endless debate about like what proportion elected, what proportion appointed, what electoral system, what is a region, all this kind of thing. It will kill it. That's the risk, because it will just take up too much time. Whether the leadership does that, I don't know, but it was a little bit disheartening to see that there wasn't more detail on that point in the Brown review. It was just, oh, the Lords needs to be democratic, big question mark about what that means. So I'd hope that Labour make more progress on that.
And there is a strategic lesson for us all. If a self-confessed geek says don't have a long discussion about systems, it will kill it. Rob, you have been, as always, absolutely brilliant. Someone said in the chat, lucky the students at Manchester University, and really we do appreciate it. It's always great to have you. We'll give you a job at LCR. I think Sandy will take you on as a volunteer if you like. We certainly let you be a volunteer for our campaign, but that was just a masterclass without us paying £9,000 a year for it either. So thank you very, very much indeed.